Our keynote now comes from the CEO, who other CEOs turn to for advice. He is the global chair of the Boston Consulting Group. Please welcome Rich Lesser. He'll also be joined shortly by Christoph Gebald for a brief discussion after. Please take the stage, Rich. Thank you.
So good afternoon. It is so wonderful to be at this DAC Summit with all of you, to see the passion and energy to advance this critical technology. This is a topic that's been on my mind for quite a while now, as BCG has looked to make its own commitments to being net zero by 2030. And I think we have opportunities, but I think the starting point for this conversation, indeed this whole day, is a simple and uncomfortable truth, which is the world will not get to 1.5 degrees on a reduction strategy alone. We need to be, in every company and every industry, reducing our emissions footprint as much as we can, but reductions will not get us to 1.5 sufficiently. And that means we need to be able to remove carbon and remove it at huge scale if we're going to have a chance to keep within reasonable planetary boundaries, whether it's 1.5 degrees or as close to 1.5 degrees as we can possibly get. Within that scheme, we're going to have to pursue a range of removal technologies. We're going to have to pursue nature-based solutions like regenerative agriculture and reforestation. We're going to have to pursue engineered solutions like carbon capture and storage and like direct air capture. And of all of them, direct air capture offers some enormous benefits. It's scalable, it's verifiable, it's extremely high quality, and you can have a lot of flexibility on where you locate it. But of course, the elephant in the room is actually a big elephant, which is it costs way too much today. And that at the $600 to $1,000 a ton that direct air capture costs right now, you can find a few companies, particularly when you add in the IRA subsidy that came about in last year's legislation. So you can find the BCGs or Swiss Re's or JP Morgan's or Microsoft's that are ready to make some commitments, even at very high prices. But the truth is that the vast majority of companies are not going to be ready to make commitments at those prices, and certainly nowhere near the volumes that we need to really take on this challenge. So that brings us to a simple question, and the research, one of the privileges of being the global chair is that sometimes you get to really push something you think is important. And for me, among the most important topics in the world right now, and certainly for us in our own internal thinking and the work we do with our clients, is, well, can we really dramatically lower the cost of direct air capture? Can we get it down to $200? Can we ideally get it substantially below $200, approaching $150 or even $100 a ton? And I've had the privilege of having some amazing colleagues who've been digging into this topic for most of this year and actually engaging with many in the industry and beyond to look into that. And the conclusions of that, which I'm only going to do the very top lines today, and I have colleagues who are much more expert than me that are in the room if at a break you want to dig in more to it, and we just published a report online yesterday around this. The conclusion is that getting to 200 and even well below 200 is possible, but it's going to take an enormous amount of work. It's going to take government support, it's going to take new models of collaboration, and it's going to take building at a scale that is much faster than the pathways we're currently on. And therefore, a business as usual approach is not going to get us where we need to. And the question is how we can all work together as an industry and with many beyond it to try to change that business as usual approach and go faster. So I'm just going to highlight a few things quickly before Christoph and I have a chance to talk. The first is something that probably many of you have seen in different forms, but simply that removals is a key part of the strategy, and that's not a BCG conclusion. That's a conclusion of many others, including here the IPCC. They've produced a number of scenarios about how we can get down to a 1.5 world, a net zero world. And what you can see here is that the green part, bringing down the dark green, bringing down the reduction part, bringing down emissions, is obviously absolutely critical, but it is not going as fast as we need it to. And I think I hear in the opportunity to talk to CEOs all around the world, all of the challenges that companies are facing in moving reductions forward as fast as they would like. And that puts more of a premium in a world where we can't reduce as fast as we would ideally need to be able to complement that with removals at scale, not removals with plants here and there or small amounts of agriculture, but removals at gigaton level scale. Probably there's a range of scenarios, there's no pinpoint number, but probably an order of magnitude of 10 gigatons of carbon back in the ground by 2050 per year. And if you look at it growing, it grows over the course of the century under this sort of midline scenario to closer to 20 billion gigatons. As I said, there's a range of technologies that can do that. There is no one solution, but DAC is and should be a critical part of that journey to bring the removals to the scale that we need at the unprecedented speed that we need to create this entirely new industry. The second point is, why do we need to lower the cost? I mean, I'll come at it from two ways. First, what's on this chart, and second, the conversations that I get to have and the work that we do with our clients. This was work that we did with EDF, and basically we surveyed hundreds of potential customers for various carbon reduction and removal technologies. And we asked them, at what stage would you begin to take this as part of your voluntary package? And what you can see is at the very high price points we're at today, it's not zero. I named a few companies earlier, but the truth is it's very, very few companies that are willing to make this a part of their voluntary removals. As the costs get lower, you start to see many more saying we would want this as part of our voluntary removals package. And the inflection points that we would observe are, one is around $200 a ton and one is around $100 a ton. And I realize, we don't get to wish this and have it come true. It has to be technically feasible. I'll get to that in a second. But we have to be honest in acknowledging that if we're going to have this be a big part of the solution at gigaton scale, which is what the world needs, then we need to be able to find ways to lower the cost, and I'm going to come to that in a second. I will come at it from the other angle too. A lot of BCG's work with our clients is helping them draw essentially carbon abatement curves. So how much does it cost? And in some cases, how much do you save by removing carbon from the most advantageous ton to remove to the most costly ton to remove? And we do these across industries, value chains, and companies. And what we see over and over again is that the actual first, say, 40 to 50% can often be done at low to no cost with renewable energy, sometimes even with a positive return. There's another 20 to 30 or 40% that you can reduce at quite moderate cost, well below these $100 to $200 a ton. But for most companies, and for sure for most value chains, you end up with 20 to 40% of the abatement curve that costs north of $150, sometimes well north of $200 a ton. So if we can take DAC and bring it down to a reasonable cost in this range, in this $100 to $200 range, we not only have more people wanting to use it as part of their voluntary emissions, we have more companies that as they draw their curves can suddenly cap the last part of that emissions line and use this technology instead of much higher cost technologies, which comes with real economic benefits. So then the question is how to do it. And this has gone in much more detail in the report, so I would refer you to that. But I would just highlight our business as usual approach doesn't get us there. That we believe that if we're on our current pathways, we're more likely heading to $300 to $400 a ton, which, by the way, is well below where we are today. We're not at all saying we can't get better than we are, but that pathway doesn't get us close to the sort of gigaton plus scale that we need. The energy prices we modeled in a base case scenario are pretty high. The weighted average cost of capital, where you include debt that looks at this as a pretty risky proposition and is not willing to come in big ways and is relatively high cost, combined with equity owners that also see it as risky and demand high equity returns, means that the overall weighted cost of capital are pretty high, less than the cost of capital for a whole new venture space typically, but still quite high for what this industry needs. and that we assume that the traditional learning rates, even if we do better than classic learning rates of 9, 10%, even in the 11 to 13% range, we're not dropping the cost fast enough. Then we looked at two scenarios. What does it take to get below $200 a ton? That would mean, we believe, getting to cumulative capacity such that we'd be at 1 to 2 gigatons per year of annual volume. That's the sort of volumes we need, where we believe you get enough cumulative learning to drive down the curve. We need substantially lower energy costs. We need to find ways to lower the cost of capital. I'll come back to that in a second. And we need to be able to have good learning curves that go along with that. And if we want to get to in the range of $100 a ton, probably below 100 is quite optimistic, I would say, but even getting close to $100 a ton, then we're going to need to be even higher in terms of the amount of capacity we build. We're going to need to be even cheaper in terms of energy. We're going to have to treat this. I want to come back to this weighted average cost of capital. There's an interesting analogy that came about in doing our work, which is to think of carbon dioxide in the air much as a municipal waste. And if you think about it as municipal waste, we pay $170 to $200 a ton in the wealthier countries to deal with municipal waste as end-to-end costs. So if we think of the carbon dioxide that's in the air as waste, a range of $100 to $200 a ton is not a crazy range to be in. But how do cities and governments handle that? Well, they make it as cheap as possible for people to put capital in. They provide municipal bonds. They do other ways to lower the cost of capital to get it closer to a 5 to 7% range for capital rather than the sort of 10+ range we're in. And then finally, we need to push as much as we can to get the learning rates up. If you look at gas turbines, they were on a 15% learning curve in terms of capital costs, meaning every time volumes doubled, you could lower costs by 15%. Those are the sort of ranges we're going to need in terms of the capital we deploy here, which is tremendous amounts of capital to be able to bring the cost down. And in order to do that, we need to think about learning as an industry, not just learning as individual companies. Individual companies learning will be relatively slow. Industry working together, often with prodding by government or other investors to say, not on core technologies that allow you to be differentiated, your sorbents or particular aspects that give you competitive advantage, but on all sorts of enabling technologies, from fans and pumps and handling massive amounts of carbon dioxide and putting it back in the ground. We need the industries working together to drive cumulative learning as fast as we possibly can to get those learning rates as high as we can possibly get them. And that if we can do those things, if we can start to view this as a necessary waste removal, like we view so many others, if we can accelerate collaboration in the industry, if we can locate this in places and support it with the cheapest energy that we can find, and if we can create all sorts of incentives and government support to drive volume, then we can get it to the kind of cost range where this can really be a part of the long-term solution. So let me pause there. Christoph, I think you and I were going to talk for a few minutes, and look forward to getting into stuff. Thanks.
Rich, you're one of the most renowned people when it comes to leadership and sustainability. And like having someone like you and educating the most important leaders of this planet on sustainability, having someone like you on this conference is big news. This morning I talked about widening circles, and I reached out to you and asked you to join this conference. This was one of the bigger news of the last year. Now, even bigger than that, for me to see, is that someone like you, working on a level like you do, being knowledgeable in air capture and commissioning the work that you commissioned, which is crucial to our industry, is very important for us going forward. So I'm wondering, how did you come about air capture?
Yeah, well, first I just have to admit that for me, the starting journey, much as we do so much work for clients now, was about what BCG needed to do to become net zero ourselves. Because if you look at our footprint is 78%, our baseline footprint, it's gotten better since then, but our baseline footprint is 78% aviation. We fly. I mean, we're here, we're going to clients all the time. And when you fly, you produce carbon in the atmosphere as well as other things. And so we've been on a journey ourselves for how to decarbonize BCG and how to be truly net zero by 2030. And we quickly concluded that, one, we can reduce the amount of travel intensity per person in BCG quite substantially, but we will still, even in 2030, be flying a lot, which means we'll be putting a lot of carbon in the air. Avoidance-related offsets we didn't feel were real enough, so we needed to remove. And while some of our removals can be nature-based, that we felt it was critical for people like us to be early catalysts to be a part of the engineered solutions world. So then you get to the second question, well, sustainable aviation fuel. Why don't we just buy tons and tons of sustainable aviation fuel? And we are buying a lot, and we will buy a lot. I guess I'll give you an analogy, which is what I think about all the time. I think sustainable aviation fuel is the equivalent of a solution for AB positive blood. If someone had a blood disease and they were AB positive, you'd say we need a solution for AB positive blood, and you would look to invest to create that solution. But the truth is only 3% of the population in the world has AB positive blood, so you'd come up with that solution. Wouldn't it be better to invest, if you're gonna put tons of money in, wouldn't it be better to invest in O negative blood? Because if you invest in O negative blood, you not only solve your problem, your AB positive blood problem, you solve it for anybody's blood, because O negative is the universal donor, and you can put it anywhere. In my mind, DAC is the universal donor in the carbon capture world. If we can make, I know it's super hard, I know it's way too expensive, I'm sure you all who work in the industry every day come up against all the obstacles to do it. So it would be arrogant to tell you, there's some easy solution. But if we can solve it, it is the O negative blood of carbon capture, of carbon removal, which we desperately need in the world. So we started putting more time into it. We tried to understand the landscape, and then with this, we're trying to, come to our own conclusions about how much effort to put into it, and we believe it's worth a lot of effort.
Well, with the business model you're having at the Boston Consulting Group, you're obviously seeing a lot on the market. And again, you're consulting a lot of corporations on sustainability generally, but maybe also on carbon dioxide removal specifically. And I think it would be a waste if we didn't ask you, what are you seeing on the market when it comes to sustainability in general and carbon dioxide removal specifically, or air capture specifically?
So I'll give you the good news and the challenges. The good news is, in all honesty, I see a lot more companies at the most senior levels realizing that being a part of moving to a net zero world is an important part of their responsibilities, and I would say equally encouraging, an important source of future business opportunity, because we all know it's much easier to commit time and energy and investment when you think it's actually going to help your business be more successful than when you do it as an obligation to someone else or to society, but it's not going to help you. And I think more and more companies are realizing that the tailwinds provided by $3 to $5 trillion a year of global investment in sustainability, that those tailwinds make it more likely, if you're playing with those tailwinds, to find sources of growth in your business than if there were headwinds. So that's the encouraging part, and you see it in the number of people signed up for SBTI, you see it in a lot of things. The second encouraging part is, I think some of the measurement frameworks, I had a chance to listen in on the MRV discussion earlier. I really thought it was well articulated how important that is. And I would say that, having measurements that people need to report, that force transparency, are very good. I love what ISSB is doing. There's some other reporting initiatives I think may be more challenging, but I think what ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, is doing is great, so that's good. Now that's the good parts. The hard part is, one, it's just not fast enough. It is just not fast enough. And I think most people realize just how unlikely it is we can get to 1.5 degrees. Probably not impossible. There can always be breakthroughs, but extremely challenging. But the honest truth is, if we don't get to 1.5, we need 1.6. And if we don't get to 1.6, we need 1.7. And we need to push as fast as we can. And the second is, because of some of the pressures from society, because of the way things are counted, I see a lot of emphasis on reductions, and I don't think enough companies are embracing where removals fit in that journey. And so part of what I try to do in almost every discussion, of course, is to encourage every kind of reductions that they can do as fast as they can do them, but then to get them to acknowledge that between the risks of permitting delays, the risks of access to materials, all of the challenges that they have to work through, that probably won't be at a pace they desire, and they should be looking at different kinds of removals as a part of that mix, and I'd say we're very early on in that journey.
Yeah. Well, I can share with you what we are seeing on the market, and I had a sneak preview at the report you published yesterday, and I saw that there's a cost potential of $70, if I'm not wrong, for like the low temperature.
When we did the best case, we came out to $70 to $90 a ton, but I didn't talk about that here because we think that's a real stretch to be.
So I can already imagine that some people out there will think, oh, wow, that's amazing, like $70 to $90 in 2050. Why don't I wait until 2050? It'll be a good deal until then, right? So, and this we're seeing quite often. What should we tell them? If people say, hey, net zero in 2050, that's a long time to go, why should they act now? Like, what should we tell potential buyers of carbon removal to act now?
So it's really the wrong way to think about it. I mean, I don't know how blunt you are in your conversations. I tend to be pretty blunt, so you can decide. But I think that we have a responsibility, every one of us, in every firm that we're in, to be looking at how we accelerate on that journey and how we help others accelerate. And the first way we help others accelerate is we look in our value chains. We look at the suppliers and the customers we work with, and we think not just about what we do, but what we do to create the right mindset, incentives, shared learning to do that. But then second, we all have to lift our heads up from our own value chains and look at the broader industry view. If people don't the charts were very clear. If we don't get to gigatons worth of capacity in 2050, we have no shot to get the costs down to where we need them. So it's like a vicious cycle. If everybody takes that mindset, not my problem, come back to me when it's $100 a ton or whatever the number is, or 125 even. We'll never get the early investments that we need to do this. And I think one of your speakers earlier talked about the role of government in that, and I really agree with that individual. I do want governments to step up, and I was making a big push a year ago to make sure that we put as much support in for removals as part of the IRA deal. I hope that, when Europe eventually comes up with something, removals will be a part of that. I believe in government, but I believe companies have a responsibility too, and they can choose. For some of them, it will make more sense to do regenerative agriculture and soil. For some, CCUS, and really focusing on that will be important. But for, like I said, it's negative blood. So every company should be trying to find at least a little slice that they can do to incent the growth here, which will then benefit everyone.
Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out BCG is one of our early clients. Like you were one of the very early ones moving and actually buying carbon dioxide removal from Climeworks. And I'm wondering whether there are any experiences you can share, like over the time, like you have been in the market for quite some while, and I'm wondering whether there are any experiences based on the carbon removal procurement you can share with the audience.
I think, look, the one thing I would say, and I know many of you are probably in the industry talking to potential customers, it is really complicated to sort all this through. And I would just say from our end, we have a fantastic team working on this, a number of whom are here today, that are working on it. But, even with us, it's taken us a really long time to feel like we really understand it. We understand the obstacles. We can pressure test the economics to feel good. We know how things like the incentives in IRA get worked into your plans. And so I think that you can't overestimate how important it is to invest in education for the broader corporate and government landscape, and to have them see that supporting this is not some moral hazard, that means you're anti-reductions or you're working against reductions. We need both. The IPCC says that. Everybody who looks at it carefully knows that. How you're a part of the solution, how your economics work, and how their early investments in you fundamentally can change the curve that will benefit them and benefit everyone. And then the second is, everybody needs role models. We all do. So I would say, the advantage of getting one customer is you have the ability to use them as an example, particularly if it's someone they respect, of someone who made this choice, and maybe use that to help get a second customer and a third customer. And getting your customers talking to each other, particularly when you have some forward-leaning ones, I think that can make a real difference to help get others who are sort of at a tipping point to maybe tip in the direction of taking a chance rather than sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah. Last market question, because we switched to standard setters. Going forward, what are you seeing on the market? Volumes, prices, anything you can share? You mentioned sustainable aviation fuels. At the end of the day, that's my favorite interview question, how do we make CDR attractive in light of sustainable aviation fuels? What are you seeing
Well,
on
those
the
are
market?
two separate questions. So my team is closer to it. I think I'm encouraged. Look, $180 a ton is probably not what the industry needs given the current price point. I think it would actually be exactly the right subsidy in the 2030s when we can get costs hopefully down to 400 and we're subsidizing down to the low 200s. You know, but I think the 180 is a bit short now, but it is a meaningful amount of a subsidy. Like, it's a hell of a lot better than any of us thought a year ago on this day we were going to have coming out of the U.S., and hopefully other countries will get close to it. Look, we were hoping, including the subsidies, I mean, with subsidies on top, to seeing prices in the low to mid 300s. I think that we're not quite there yet, to be honest. We're starting to see things getting close, but probably not quite there. But I feel like that's the range where I think you'd start to get a lot of early entrants. You know, I showed you that curve. You're even at, 300 or 325, which would be 500 after the subsidy. You're not going to get a lot of players in, but you don't need a lot right now. You need enough to be able to build some of these early plants and get things going. My instinct is we're not quite there yet. We're probably one generation too early for that, but that's what I think could make a difference. But you all are in the market, I'm not, so I may be too optimistic or too pessimistic. So I don't want to overstate relative to the expertise that sits in this room.
Yeah. Well, turning to standard setters, Science-Based Target Initiative, UN, at the end of the day, they are determining how the market rolls, right? They the rules,
very much.
How we play. Like, in your point of view, like, what is the role they play and what does it mean for them?
I think, and I'm not saying anything I haven't said to SBTI. First, I have enormous respect for SBTI. The world is better because they're here. They're in a world where the amount of demand for what they do is scaling up dramatically. It's a NGO that was set up, that's got enormous scaling. So I want to say this with tremendous empathy for what they're doing. But I think that I'm really hoping that one of the evolutions they'll take soon is to put more legitimacy on removals as part of the pathway, not just within a sector. So a cement company is allowed to do CCUS, but not, someone who's out of the sector. A food company is allowed to invest heavily in regenerative agriculture and have it count, but not a non-food company. I'm really hoping that they'll see that the power of removals and get to some economic requirements. Well, you have to spend at least so much per ton. Like, we shouldn't be able to play $2 and $5 a ton games and get credit. I mean, this isn't about the old avoidance stuff that, we were reading about, some of which has legitimacy issues and should not count as being different from reducing. But I think with enough of a cost parameter around it, I think that having them recognize removals as an important pathway is important. But I think the starting point, to me, the clear starting point is DAC. Because one, it sure isn't cheap, right? So no one's investing in DAC because there's some huge cost savings project there. We all know that. And two, DAC is the universal, whatever this, I don't know this molecule of carbon dioxide, where it came from, who produced it, whether it was here when the dinosaurs were here or whether it was here last week from a power plant. But what I do know is when I put it back in the ground, 1,000 feet under the ground, and it eventually solidifies, that it doesn't matter where it came from, it went back in. And so for me, DAC, provided it's verified, all the MRV stuff we talked about earlier, provided all that, to me that is such a clear and obvious place to work with no moral hazards, with encouragement to build an industry that everybody knows we desperately need decades from now. And the only argument I hear against that I feel has legitimacy is, well, we know it can never get cheap enough to be part of the solution. And since we know it can never be cheap enough, then we shouldn't bother to invest now because that's a dollar taken away from doing something else. But in my mind, the whole history of humanity, including in this space, solar, wind, batteries, is that these technologies go so much further than where you think they can go on day one. And that to take one of the most obvious solutions and not do everything we can to give it its best shot to work before we write it off is really doing a disservice to the planet, to people all over the world, to our grandchildren's generations. DAC will not so much touch our children, but it'll have an enormous impact if it works on our grandchildren's lives. And I just don't see why you would, having looked at other technologies, be so quick to come to a conclusion, well, this one can't work, so it's a waste of money, so put your money into, the last ton of reductions or something else. But I do think that's I think that plus the moral hazard that people should only focus on reducing and removals is an excuse to not reduce, or you reduce everything and only in 2050, back to your earlier question, then it's okay to do removals. I think first we need it faster. Second, we can't get it cheap enough unless we invest. So I think that's a little of the logic, but we need to change that logic.
Rich, thank you. Those are very strong points to end on. Again, it's a big pleasure and privilege to have you with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all you're doing. Okay, thanks. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.